She told me I needed to submit a written request 48 hours in advance if I wanted to attend my granddaughter's birthday party. Not the party of a stranger's child, my own granddaughter, turning 5. I was standing in the kitchen of my son's house in Kelowna, holding a wrapped gift, a wooden puzzle I'd driven 2 hours to find at a specific toy shop because my daughter-in-law had mentioned once, in passing, that she didn't like plastic. I had remembered that. I had driven to find the right thing. And Renata was standing across the island from me with the patient, organized expression of someone who had prepared for this conversation and was now delivering it on schedule. "It's just how we're managing the calendar," she said. Going forward, my son Liam was in the living room. I could hear the hockey game. "My name is Arthur Beliveau. I'm 61 years old. I spent 28 years working as a structural engineer for the province of British Columbia. Bridges, retaining walls, load assessments for municipal projects, and I retired early when my wife Agnes got sick. Agnes passed 3 years ago, ovarian cancer, 14 months from the first symptom to the last morning. She was the kind of person who kept a handwritten calendar on the fridge with everyone's birthdays written in different colored ink, who baked butter tarts at Christmas for the neighbors on both sides and the ones across the street too, who could make a stranger feel like a guest and a guest feel like family within about 10 minutes of walking through her door. She had loved Liam without condition and without limit. She had held our granddaughter Petra, that's what I'll call her here, in the hospital the afternoon she was born, and she had cried in a way I hadn't seen from her in 34 years of marriage, quiet tears that she didn't bother wiping because her hands were full. She used to say Petra was the thing that made the hard part feel survivable. After Agnes died, I tried to be present without being heavy about it. I didn't want to become a burden that my son had to manage. I called ahead. I kept my visits to once a week or so, usually Sunday afternoons. I'd bring something small, a library book Petra might like, a jar of the strawberry jam Agnes used to make that I'd learned to make myself because it seemed important to keep making it. It felt like the most ordinary thing in the world, watching Petra grow. She had Agnes's laugh. That specific kind of laugh that starts in the chest before it reaches the face. But there had always been something careful about Renata, not unkind exactly, careful, organized in a way that extended to people as much as it extended to schedules. When she and Liam first got together, I'd told myself it was just a personality difference and that I should respect it. She liked things a particular way. So did a lot of people. I kept my distance. I didn't offer opinions I wasn't asked for. I didn't interfere. When Liam and Renata bought their house in Kelowna, a newer build in a quiet subdivision near the lake, I gave them $75,000. It was the money Agnes and I had set aside from the sale of her parents' property in the Okanagan, money we'd been holding for years, not quite knowing what to use it for. We'd always imagined it might go toward something for Liam one day. It went toward the down payment. I didn't attach conditions. I didn't ask for a timeline or a repayment plan. It was family and it was money, and the two things seemed simple enough to put together. I didn't understand yet that Renata did not experience gifts the same way I gave them. It started gradually, the way these things do when you're inside them. First, it was the notice requirement for visits. Then it was a preference that I call before I came rather than texting, because she said she found texts harder to track. Then I was asked to park on the street because the driveway was needed for Renata's car and a delivery van that sometimes came on Sundays. Then I was told that Petra was on a new eating routine and that I shouldn't bring food anymore, even the jam, because it disrupted the plan. Then one Sunday I drove the 2 hours from Vernon, where I'd moved after Agnes passed to be closer to my sister, and Renata answered the door and told me Petra was having a rest and it wasn't a good time and that I should have called first. I had called first. I had a record of it on my phone. I mentioned it to Liam the next time we spoke. He said Renata was just particular about schedules. He said, "You know how she is, Dad." I did know how she was. What I was beginning to understand was that Liam had stopped noticing the distance between what was reasonable and what was actually happening. The document arrived by email about 7 months after Agnes died. It had a header. It had numbered clauses. Renata had written it herself, apparently a formal outline of the terms under which I could be involved in Petra's life. Visits were to be arranged a minimum of 72 hours in advance. No gifts without prior approval submitted in writing. No photographs shared on any platform without explicit written consent per occurrence. No discussion of family finances. No overnight visits under any circumstances. Full stop. At the bottom there was a field for my electronic signature. I didn't sign it. I called Liam and asked if we could meet somewhere in person. He said he'd been meaning to call me too. We met at a coffee shop in Peachland, roughly halfway between us, neutral ground, which told me something about how far things had drifted. He sat across from me with the expression of someone who had been briefed. He told me Renata felt the current arrangement wasn't working. He used the word boundaries several times. I asked him which specific boundaries hadn't been respected, because I had followed every instruction she'd given me, had called ahead, had kept my distance, had swallowed more than I was comfortable swallowing. He talked for a while about how visits were stressful for Petra, a claim that puzzled me given that Petra ran down the hallway toward me every time I arrived and called me Grandpa Art, with a particular emphasis on the art that Agnes had always found delightful. I let him finish. Then I asked him directly, "Do you want me in Petra's life?" He said yes. He said, "Of course." Then he told me about the new proposal. Renata had decided that if I wanted consistent access to Petra, it would be reasonable for me to contribute to what she called a grandparent participation fund. Not a gift, she had apparently specified. A standing monthly transfer of $900 to an account she managed, as a condition of regular visits. She calls it a family investment arrangement, Liam said, not quite looking at me. I looked at my coffee. Then I looked at my son, who was 40 years old and was sitting in a coffee shop in Peachland, telling me that time with my granddaughter now had a monthly fee attached to it. I said I needed some time to think about it. He nodded as though that was a perfectly sensible response to a perfectly sensible proposal. I drove back to Vernon in the kind of quiet that isn't restful. It's the quiet of a person trying very hard not to say something they'll regret. I didn't sleep well. I sat at the kitchen table where Agnes and I used to do the crossword on Saturday mornings, and I thought about Petra's laugh and the strawberry jam I'd been making to keep something of Agnes alive in the world, and I thought about $75,000 going into a house that now came with a sign-in policy. And then I thought about a conversation I'd had about 4 months before that with my sister Helen's neighbor, a retired solicitor named Douglas Watts, who'd handled family law files for most of his career before he moved to the Okanagan. We'd talked briefly at a dinner Helen had hosted. He'd given me his card because I'd mentioned Liam in passing, and he'd said quietly that if anything ever felt off, I should feel free to call. The card was on my desk. I found it without looking too hard. I called Douglas the next morning. He picked up himself. We talked for nearly an hour. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Arthur, I want you to do a few things before we speak again. I want you to save every email, every text message, every document Renata has sent you. I want you to write down with dates every visit that was canceled, shortened, or denied. And I want you to call your accountant about the $75,000. I asked him why the accountant specifically. Because in British Columbia, he said, money given to a family member can be treated differently under family property law depending on the circumstances and how it was documented. I want to understand the full picture before we do anything else. I had used the same accountant for 18 years, a methodical man named Stephen Varga who worked out of a small office in Coldstream and kept records the way engineers keep load calculations, in order, double-checked, and permanent. I called him that same afternoon. What Stephen found took him 2 days to piece together, and when he called me back, his voice was careful in the way that voices get careful when someone has found something unexpected. The $75,000 I'd transferred to Liam and Renata's joint account hadn't stayed there. Over a period of about 16 months following the home purchase, a series of transfers had moved funds out of the joint account and into a separate account registered to a numbered company. Stephen had found it through business registry filings. The company was registered in Renata's name only, incorporated 4 months after the house purchase, with a mailing address that matched the Kelowna property. $41,000 had moved through that channel over 14 months, in amounts small enough not to flag immediately, to a business that appeared to have no employees, no contracts, and no discernible purpose. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after Stephen told me this. I thought about Liam's face at the coffee shop, that careful, coached expression. I wondered how much of what he'd been telling me over the past 2 years was Renata's script and how much of it he actually believed. I wondered if he knew about the company. Sitting there, I decided he probably didn't. And somehow that made it worse, not better. Douglas and Stephen worked together over the following 8 weeks. I said nothing to Liam or Renata. I kept calling ahead for my approved Sunday windows. I kept parking on the street. I showed up with nothing in my hands since food and gifts required paperwork I hadn't submitted. I sat in their living room and watched Petra do drawings of horses. She was going through a horse phase, and told her about the deer that came into my backyard in the mornings, which she found more interesting than I could have predicted. She asked me once during those 8 weeks if I was okay, because she said I seemed far away. I told her I was fine. I told her I was just thinking. About what? She asked. About the deer, I said. The ones in your yard? Those exact ones, I said. I was thinking they probably miss you. She accepted this with the absolute confidence of a 5-year-old who considers it entirely reasonable that wild animals might have opinions about her, and went back to her horse. At the end of the 8th week, Douglas told me we had what we needed. He had drafted a formal legal letter asserting my rights under British Columbia's Family Law Act, which does allow grandparents to apply to the court for contact with a grandchild when that contact is being unreasonably withheld. Something I had not known before Douglas, and something I suspect Renata had been counting on me not knowing. The letter was not aggressive. It was precise. It named dates, named the pattern, and made clear that I was prepared to pursue court-ordered contact if the current arrangement continued. Stephen had prepared a financial summary as a separate document. Every transfer, every date, the numbered company, the amount. A clean, documented account of where $41,000 of family money had gone after it left the joint account. Money that, under the circumstances and given the lack of any documentation treating it as a gift rather than a contribution, Douglas believed could be argued as a recoverable loan. I put both documents in a large envelope, the old-fashioned kind sealed with Douglas's letterhead visible on one of the pages inside. I called Liam and asked if I could come by on Sunday as usual. He said that was fine. I drove to Kelowna with the envelope on the seat beside me. Renata answered the door. She was wearing the same composed, courteous expression she always wore when I arrived. The one that looked like a smile but functioned more like a policy. I could hear Petra somewhere down the hallway talking to what I assume was a stuffed animal, because she was explaining something to it at some length. I said I had something for Liam. Renata started to say something about the timing, about how Liam was in the middle of something. I said it would only take a moment. I asked her to get him. Liam came to the door. He saw the envelope. Something shifted in his face, not recognition exactly. More like a door somewhere in him that had been slightly ajar suddenly swung open a little wider. I handed it to him. He opened it in the doorway, Renata standing just behind his left shoulder. He read the first page of Douglas's letter, then the second. His face did a complicated thing. Not one emotion landing cleanly, but several arriving at once and none of them finding anywhere to sit. He looked up at me. "Dad, what is this?" "It's a letter from my lawyer," I said, "and a financial summary from my accountant. I think you'll want to read both carefully. And then I think you'll want to have a conversation with your wife." He looked at Renata. She looked at the envelope, and something in her expression that had always been managed very carefully stopped being managed quite so carefully. "I don't know what he's told you," she started. "Renata." I said it quietly. "The company is documented. The transfers are documented. Stephen found everything through the provincial registry. It's all in the second document." I wasn't angry. I want to say that clearly. I've spent my career working with load calculations and structural assessments, and I understand that emotion applied in the wrong direction at the wrong moment is how things crack. I was calm in the particular way that follows 8 weeks of preparation. "This isn't a confrontation," I said. "I'm not here to make a scene. I'm here because Liam deserves to know what's been happening in his own household, and because I deserve to see my granddaughter." Renata didn't say anything after that. Liam read for a long time. Petra appeared at some point, sliding under his arm the way small children do when they sense something significant is happening and want to be part of it anyway, and she looked up at me with Agnes's eyes. "Hi, Grandpa Art," she said. "Hi, sweetheart," I said. Liam looked at me over her head. His expression was something I don't have a clean word for. It was the look of a man who has just been handed the answer to a question he hadn't known how to ask. "Come in, Dad," he said. We sat at their kitchen table for almost 3 hours. Renata initially tried to explain the numbered company as a savings vehicle, as tax planning, as something she'd set up for Petra's future. But Stephen's summary was detailed and the timeline was exact. And at a certain point, explanations require more material than she had available, and she went quiet. Liam called Douglas himself the following week, not as an adversary, as someone who needed to understand what had happened in his own house and what his options were. There were a great many conversations after that. Some I was part of and many I wasn't, and I won't tell Liam's story for him. What I can tell you is that 8 months later, Renata had moved out, and Liam and I were splitting Sundays. One Sunday he had Petra, one Sunday I did, and we were rotating in a way that worked better for everyone than any laminated policy had ever managed to. The $41,000 became part of the separation proceedings. Douglas advised me that the full amount wasn't realistically recoverable given the documentation gaps, and that pursuing it further would cost more in legal fees and Liam's stress than it was likely to return. We settled for a partial recovery. Some things cost what they cost, and you decide what you can live with. What I want to say to you, if you're watching this and something in it sounds like your own life, if you're a grandparent sitting somewhere with a document in your email that governs how you love your grandchild, or a parent who has slowly been edged away from your son or daughter by increments small enough that you kept telling yourself it was probably fine. What I want to say is that what happened to me has a shape. It's recognizable. It starts with rules that seem reasonable and ends with love that has been made conditional, and the person being managed often can't see the full shape of it from the inside because they're too busy being cooperative. Grandparents in British Columbia have legal standing. Under the Family Law Act, a grandparent can apply for contact with a grandchild when that contact is being unreasonably denied. I did not know this before Douglas Watts. I'm telling you now because you might not know it either, and the people who would prefer you not to know it are counting on that. And if you give money to family, which I believe in, which I would do again, document it. Not because you distrust them, because documentation protects everyone. A simple letter confirming the amount, the purpose, and how it's being given can be the difference between a recoverable situation and a permanent loss. I learned that the hard way, and I am telling you for free. Last month, Petra and I drove out to a conservation area east of Vernon where Agnes used to take Liam when he was small. There's a trail along a creek that gets good bird activity in the early morning, and I'd been telling Petra about it for months. We went on a Saturday, just the two of us, in my old truck with her backpack full of snacks she had packed herself, which included 4 granola bars, a juice box, and a single cherry tomato in a plastic bag, because she had decided that was sufficient. We saw a great blue heron standing absolutely still in the shallows. Petra had never seen one before. She grabbed my hand without thinking about it. "What is that?" she whispered. "It's a heron," I said. "It's enormous." "They are," I said. Agnes used to call them the old men of the river. Petra considered this for a moment with the gravity of someone weighing important information. "Was Agnes your wife?" she asked. "She was Liam's mom." "That's right." She looked back at the heron. It hadn't moved. "I think she was right," Petra said finally. "It does look like an old man." I took a photo of the heron on my phone. Then I took one of Petra looking at it because the expression on her face was one I wanted to keep. I texted the heron photo to Liam. He sent back a single emoji, the one that's laughing so hard it's crying, and then he wrote, "Mom would have made that bird a whole personality." She would have. She absolutely would have. I kept both photos. I printed the one of Petra and put it in a frame on the kitchen windowsill, next to the one I have of Agnes holding her in the hospital, 2 days after she was born, when the light in that room was the particular gold of a late September afternoon, and Agnes was looking down at her with an expression that I have never found the right words for, and I have stopped trying. Because some things don't need words. They just need to be kept.